Hello, everyone, and welcome to the May AI ML Seminar Series, run out of NASA Ames Research Center's Exobiology branch. I'm Ryan Felton, then PMP, running this in collaboration with Caleb Scharf. And today I have the honor of actually one of the first colleagues I met way back at the beginning of grad school when I was still at Goddard, which is Daniel Angerhausen. Daniel is now way across the pond at ETH Zurich, and as we found out, he's actually right now in Bern. But today he's going to be discussing his journey through, I guess, the land of AI/ML and showing us the various techniques he's used with his projects with machine learning. So Daniel, take it away. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Ryan. It's a small word. It's always good to see people again. And this is maybe also one of the take-home messages, and keep your network. You will never know how, in which context you meet again, right? So this is really nice. Yeah, so as Ryan said, I'm Daniel, used to live in the US for quite a while. And I just want to share my story, kind of how I got into machine learning as an astrobiologist, astrophysicist, and really also some of the lessons learned, and give you some hints, some mistakes that I or people I work with made in the beginning, and hopefully give you some guidance how to apply machine learning in your domain if you're a domain scientist, or how to approach the domain if you're a machine learning scientist. So I'm not sure how exactly the audience here is. So I gave this talk already for a purely machine learning audience, and then also for a pure scientist audience. So no one complained so far, so I hope there's a little bit for everyone. So I don't want to go too detailed into the science, and I also can't go too detailed into all the machine learning techniques. So feel free to ask if you want me to dig a bit deeper into some of the points. Okay, so what I want to do today, let me see how this works. Yes. So as I mentioned, I want to talk a bit about how I got into the field and some of the lessons learned. And then I essentially want to present 3 examples of work that I've done in this field, and then also in this context, introduce a slightly different machine learning technique or classical machine learning problem, so to speak. So the first would be exoplanet detection. Then the second would be how we hopefully one day detect biosignatures with the live space mission that I was working on for the past 5 years. And then in the end, we will also talk a bit about aliens on the moon. So I hope that keeps you awake and keeps you engaged in the talk, because there's going to be aliens in the end. So in terms of techniques, this exoplanet detection would be a typical classification, machine learning classification problem. This biosignatures and spectral retrieval for the experts is more of a simulation-based inference. There's also some dimensionality reduction in there, and technically it's also a generative model, because we have an encoder and a decoder, which could by itself also be used as a generator. So it's a generative model. And then this aliens on the moon thing is actually a typical anomaly detection problem. So a lot of these typical problems that you usually, or nowadays, more and more start to solve with machine learning. So square one, how did I get into machine learning? Now, how did I learn about collaborations between domain and machine learning experts? And my entrance was the NASA Frontier Development Lab. So maybe some in the audience have heard about it. Maybe there's even some alumni on. I can see all the names, but this is how I got into the field. So this is a summer school incubator, so 8-week program, at least in that time that I participated in Silicon Valley, so really close to NASA Ames. We actually slept on the NASA campus, or in the NASA lodge next to Ames, which might be familiar to some people working there. So essentially, it's an 8-week problem, 8-week project, where we solve space science problems with machine learning, and the teams were usually half domain experts and half machine learning experts, together with some more senior mentors. And the problems really covered everything from heliophysics, predicting solar storms, to autonomous robots on the moon, or astrobiology, which was my main part, and exoplanets, at least in the first two FDLs that I worked with. Later on, also a bit of the moon stuff. So it's a tough program. So it's really 8 weeks. You work on a real world problem. Ideally, you produce, you know, some sort of, you know, software, and maybe most of the time at least like a machine learning, sometimes even a science paper in the end. And you know, you spend you know, a whole summer in 2 weeks, 2 months in Mountain View. We usually worked from the SETI Institute, essentially 24/7 with a bunch of really talented people. So, but it was really challenging, but also a great experience. So I can only recommend to people. It still exists. There's actually quite a few more frontier development labs also in Europe. One run by the SETI Institute. So there's really, I can only recommend to folks interested, either if you work as a domain scientist or if you want to get more experience in space sciences. This is really something I recommend you to look up. And some of the results I show are actually also from this frontier development lab. So my first lesson that I had to learn and that I want to share with you is this curve here. So maybe some of you have seen this before. It's obviously a bit jokingly, but you know, tongue in cheek. But this is really something that you see, you know, not just in machine learning, but almost everywhere in science or even in the public, where people, you know, call themselves experts. So you have this curve of, you know, increasing competence on this axis, and then how confident people are on the other axis. And then there's this, you know, so-called born stupid, where people really just learn the basics and immediately think they're experts. And then you learn a bit more about the topic, and then you eventually fall in this valley of despair. You actually know much more than these rookies who are very confident, but you suddenly realize how big the field is, and you have the feeling you don't understand anything. So this is also where, you know, imposter syndrome lives, which maybe some others also suffer from. And then over time, you become an expert again and again. You know, the more competence you get, and then you also, you know, you see all the problems, and you also, you know, become more confident to talk about it. But then the problem really is if you collaborate, and some people in your team are here, and some people on a team might be here. So there might actually be much more competent people who are much less confident. So then you got people who have no idea, who watched one video about autoencoders on YouTube and think they were a machine learning expert, or someone who read one review article about exoplanets and think they're exoplanet expert. But because they're so competent, because they're so confident, they speak out the loudest and think they could lead the program, or, you know, think they have a solution that no one needs. So this is really something that I figured out pretty quickly to sort out, you know, who really knows what they're talking about, and who really is, you know, just repeating stuff and is just confident without competence. So this is something, you know, always to keep in mind. Also to be critical about yourself. You know, where am I here? You know, maybe I'm not as stupid as I think. You know, maybe I'm, you know, just have imposter syndrome a bit. You know, or maybe, you know, I'm one of these people who is, you know, overconfident and I didn't really learn so much. So this is maybe one of the first take-home messages. You know, be aware of this curve, be aware where you are on this curve, you know, be aware where others in your team might be in this curve, because it could really wreck up your project. You know, if everyone in the team just trusts someone who's very confident but not competent, it's really tough. So just as a warning sign, that a little bit more concrete what that means. So the first thing that always pops up, if you have a hammer, everything is a nail. So probably many of you heard this in the context of machine learning already. So oftentimes people just use machine learning because, right? So because it's fancy, because it's this buzzword right now, and not really because it actually solves any problems. It's just because, you know, machine learning gets funded, machine learning gets, you know, press, gets you coverage, you know. So this is a problem that was often done, and in this context, it's oftentimes also solutions looking for problems. So one example that I always give is, like, if someone wants to build a classifier for Earth-like planet spectra, where you can find one planet with a biosignature in a forest of 1 million spectra. Right? This is not a problem we have. We don't have telescopes that give us 1 million spectra of exoplanets. So why would we need a classifier that finds them? Right? Just as an example of people think, oh yeah, you know, I think that's the problem that exoplanet people have, so let me solve it, right? So really, you know, and this is probably going to be repeating again and again in this talk, you know, collaborate. Go talk to domain scientists and ask them, is that really the problem that you have, right? So this is something that you should obviously also avoid. Then also something interesting, and this is also more for the machine learning people, is the metrics are not always tangible. So usually you have your metrics, area under the curve, or total recall at max precision, or some norms that you use, some likelihood functions that you minimize or whatever. So, but in the actual application, if you build software for domain scientists to use, it's not necessarily pushing 95 precision to 96% precision, or to to extend something just by a fraction of a percent when it's already 95% good. First of all, it's always compared to what is the baseline right now. So if the baseline the people in practice use is 80%, then 95% solution is as good as a 96% solution. What is more important is really, is it useful for the domain scientist? So is it something that I can include in my workflow with a couple of lines of code, or do I need to study a full PhD of machine learning myself to deploy this software, for example, right? So the metric is not just, whatever your machine learning metric is, but also how useful is the tool, how easy to apply is this tool for, an average domain scientist. This should also be your goal. Also, rule of thumb is look at the parts first. Don't try to solve the whole problem with machine learning. So oftentimes it's, a workflow where you have a couple of computational steps, let's say, and then really find the bottleneck. Find this one step in your pipeline that it's either computationally expensive, or that takes a lot of manual vetting or something like this. So it's usually a good recipe to not try to replace your whole workflow with a black box that has machine learning on it, but rather, look at all your parts and see what are the bottlenecks, what are the parts that could use or that could leverage the machine learning speed up the most. So this is usually also something I can recommend. Also important, follow the data. So really try to work in fields where data exists. So if you work on synthetic data, it's this old problem of, giga, garbage in, garbage out. If you train a model on another model, you only learn the model, you don't learn reality, right? So so really at least be careful what and then argue why you use synthetic data and where the synthetic data is coming from. And I also give you an example for where it works and where it doesn't work. So this is also important. So if you have to decide, am I working on this problem, or if you have a problem where you have, terabytes of data, and where you have a problem where you just have a couple of gigabytes of synthetic data, then probably the one with actual large data is the better project to work on. So data is in the end still, the oil this thing is working on, the energy you need inside of it. And then, I'm going to repeat this again, collaborate. So don't think as a domain scientist alone, just download PyTorch and you can do it. And on the other hand, if you're a machine learning expert, don't just read an textbook on exoplanets or the latest astrobiology primer and think you can solve all the problems. So really, this only works if you have at least an expert in both fields. Maybe after a while, maybe after, 2 postdocs where you did both, you become an expert in both of it. But usually these unicorns don't exist, that many of them, right? So really, try to collaborate. And this is really the take-home message here, very in the beginning. Okay, so first thing, exoplanets. So I guess, since this is an astrobiology crowd, I think many of you have heard about exoplanets, planets outside of our solar system. So here the first thing is, how do we first of all find them, right? So and how could machine learning help with that? And to illustrate this, I brought this video. So this is real data from the SDO, the Solar Dynamics Observatory. So this is transit. So this is real data, obviously, from Mercury transiting between us on Earth and the Sun. So every couple of years, when the orbits are aligned nicely, you can see Mercury moving between us and the Sun. And this illustrates you how tough that is for us to find exoplanets, at least Earth-sized planets, rocky planets around solar-type stars. This gives you an idea about the contrast ratios you need. We really want to find these tiny little black, not self-luminous dots next to these ginormous balls of fire, right? So this is really the challenge we have in exoplanet science. And I will talk a bit more about this also in the second part. But this also illustrates one of the solutions we have for this problem. And probably many of you heard about the Kepler telescope, the TESS telescopes. So what can I not go? Okay, so let's do it manually here. Yeah, so this is also one of the solutions. One of the solutions how we find exoplanets, this so-called transit method, where we're not just lucky that Mercury transits between us and the sun, but that also other planets around other stars are aligned in the perfect way that we look edge on the system and can really see these planets. Every orbit, they do these little dips in brightness when they pass in front of their star. So this is one of the most successful techniques to find these exoplanets. So to really stare at, hundreds of thousands of stars, do time series of the brightness and then look for these reoccurring little dips in the light curve. And this is exactly what the Kepler and Space Telescope did. So Kepler was really staring, at least for its main mission, before it became the K2 mission, where it also started to observe different fields. But for the main mission, it really stared for 2 years at one particular part of the sky and really observed the brightness of, I think, 150,000 stars every couple of minutes. And TESS did it somewhat similar, but was, or is still, tracking the whole globe. So it doesn't stay as long on one field as Kepler, but therefore it's covering the whole sky. But in the end, it's the same technique. You observe stars, you measure their brightness every couple of minutes, and then you want to find these reoccurring dips, which are signs for these exoplanets for us. And this was one of the first applications where I worked on machine learning at this FDL, at this Frontier Development Lab at the SETI Institute in Mountain View. So this shows you the typical pipeline of Kepler and TESS, right? So you have this target pixel. So this is the pixel on your detector where you measure the light. Then you take this, over a couple of years or a couple of months, every couple of minutes, then you get these really raw light curves here. There's a lot of instrumental noise on it, a lot of, photometric noise, all kinds of things happening here. The telescope might change its orbit and whatnot. So you see all these really rough, raw light curves here. Then there's, techniques to clean them up, to, correct these systematics. Then there's already, there was at this point already a good software in place that looked for these, for these transits and also, flagged so-called threshold crossing events. Then you do some sort of data validation. And then once you have these, candidates found where you see these reoccurring dips in the light curve, then you give it to this, at this point, the Kepler TCE review team. So they looked at these threshold crossing events and then essentially did human vetting of these candidates to exclude false positive. And I will show you on the next slide what these false positive means. And then in the end, you will get to this exoplanet catalogs that maybe many of you know from the Exoplanet archive, where you can look up that we have detected 5,800 today. So this is the pipeline, how we get from our measurement on the detector on the pixel to our planets. And this is one of the examples where we looked at the whole workflow and identified this human vetting process here as one of the bottlenecks. So instead of replacing everything, so like feeding our machine learning just with the target pixel files and hope it somehow magically gives us these exoplanet candidates, we looked at this workflow and said, all these steps work pretty fine. Why invent the wheel new? This part is really the bottleneck. This is where, bunch of experts, 5, 6, experts spends hundreds of human hours just going through light curve, and then by eye, deciding, okay, this might be a planet, this might not be a planet. So this is really where we could apply machine learning in one of these bottlenecks, in one of these pieces of the puzzle that were really, really stopping most of the, or really slowing down most of the workflow. So as an example, so these are these typical false positive signals that you get there. So you can have eclipsing binaries. So essentially also transits, but not a transit of a planet, but usually transit of a somewhat smaller star, sometimes even just grazing around a somewhat bigger star, which looks similar to transits, but usually has a much, deeper, because they're bigger, deeper depth than a typical planet. Then you have these background eclipsing binaries. So you could have a perfect nice star in the beginning, in the foreground, but then in the background you have, similar to here, a binary pair that also gives you these transit-like curves, but still slightly different shape. And then there might just be a weird, stellar variability, some instrumental noise that just coincidentally mimics one of these transits. So these are these typical false positives. And this is essentially what we worked on in this team. So here you see the team of the experts then, both Megan, Yanni, Michele, and you. Maybe some of you even know some of them. And then a bunch of folks from Ames and SETI, me, and a couple of machine learning experts were the mentors of this group. And this was essentially the problem we solved there. So we used a convolutional network in this case, so very relatively vanilla CNN classifier. And the thing that we added here that didn't exist before was that we added domain knowledge. So we not just fed the light curve itself into our pipeline, but also how the point spread functions, so how the shape of our pixel on the detector was changing, because this is one way to distinguish these false positives from the real planets. So we not just added the actual data, but also some domain knowledge encoded in these other time series. And this really opened the bottleneck. So first of all, it replaced, these manual wetting part, but also it improved, the speed, of course, because it didn't have, people look through it manually, but also the precision. So, and what we got was 10 to 20% higher recall for the lowest signal to noise transits. And these are also like the most interesting planets usually. So the big hot Jupiters make huge signals. These are the ones you see immediately. But these planets right on the threshold, right on this, lowest SNR, it's usually also these Earth-sized planets, the ones that are the most interesting. So so we could also increase the recall here. So these are the two papers. So it's also already a couple of years ago, so 2018, 2019. These two papers led by Megan and Hugh, where we introduced these classifiers for TESS and Kepler data at this point. Okay, so this was the first part, finding exoplanets. So the next step then is, and this is, maybe if you want the holy grail of astrobiology, at least of extrasolar astrobiology, is to eventually find biosignatures on these exoplanets. So really after finding these planets with Kepler and TESS, to really, maybe not exactly the ones that are transiting, but maybe some other planets in our neighborhood, and then really start to not just find them and know their radius and know they are there, but really characterize them, really find out, are they, more like Venus, these hellish hot planets? Are they more dry, cold worlds like Mars, or are they really these, thriving planets full of life as Earth? So this is really something that we want to find out with the next generation of telescopes. And again, to remind you, this is really, really hard. So if you, even if you figure out a technique like coronagraphy, or what I'm going to show you with live so-called nulling interferometry, even if you find a way to isolate this tiny black dot from this ginormous star, it's still a very, very faint source. So if you put just Earth on its own, so you probably all saw this pale blue dot image here. So if you put Earth at 10 parsecs, right, 30 light years distance from us roughly, it only gives you 1 photon per minute per square meter per micron if you observe at 5 microns. So if you observe in the mid-infrared, as we do with the LIVE telescope, you get 1 photon per square meter on your telescope. So it's really, 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 really low signal. You can give every photon a name if you want. So it's a really, really tough challenge for us to get, not just, first of all, separate the light of the planet from the star, but then even just count these few photons we get from these planets. And this is where LIVE comes into play. So this is the space mission I worked on for the last 5 years, established the community and wrote a bit about the science case and defined the science requirements. And now the initiative is more shifting into actually engineering and building the technical solutions to do these observations. And here's a
Are we
video.
alone in the universe? Life, the large interferometer for exoplanets, is designed to address this question by collecting infrared light from distant worlds. We know of thousands of planets orbiting other stars, and life will help us understand their diversity. For the first time, we will be able to tell if some worlds are similar to Earth. With atmospheres containing molecules such as methane or oxygen that may indicate biological activity. Our team is dedicated to discovering if life beyond Earth is rare or a widely spread outcome of cosmic evolution.
Yes, so that's the live mission. We paid a lot of money for this video, so I have to show it every time I give a talk. Yeah, so this is live, and with live, we hopefully one day actually get spectra of these Earth-like planets around solar-type stars in our local, galactic neighborhood. Just briefly, so live is supposed to be an interferometer, so it's really not just one but 4 telescopes that work together and then produce a spatial resolution of a telescope that would have the diameter of this baseline. And then the light from these 4 collector telescopes will be put in this one beam combiner telescopes, where we do this magic of nulling interferometry and isolating the signal of the planet, and then hopefully get spectra in the 4 to 18 micron mid-infrared regime of electromagnetic wave. And then at the resolution of 20 to 50, roughly, so really low spectral resolution, actually. And the idea is to have a 2.5-year search phase, where we really scan star to star in our neighborhood to see if we can find a planet, and then after 2.5 years, then look for the most promising one and really deeply characterize those that are maybe the most similar to Earth, to really figure out if they have life, if they have certain biosignatures in their atmospheres, and so on. So this is roughly the plan for life. So again, just as a reminder, we are looking at the near-infrared spectrum here. So this is, the optical light here. So this is typically how an Earth would look like. This is in the optical, you have a Rayleigh tail and then some signatures of oxygen and ozone. Then if you go toward the near infrared, you will start seeing the water, CO2, also some methane. And then once you start, so this is all the reflected light of the planet. So not actually what it's emitting itself, but just light from the star that it's reflected by the planet. And then if you go to the mid-infrared, so beyond 4 micron, let's say, you really start to see the own emission of the planet, which also helps to derive its temperature, its radius, and so on. And the HWO in the US, planned by NASA, is more working in this regime, whereas LIFE wants to focus on the mid-infrared regime. So it's really a synergistic effort. So it's not like HWO and LIFE are competing or anything. So it's really looking at different parts of this problem, at different molecules, at different parameters of the planet, and really, if we put both together, we would get a perfect picture of these extrasolar planets. So in the end, what we do, long story short, is we hopefully get these spectra, these spectral signatures, these spectral fingerprints of these planets. And then the problem is, what do we learn from this spectrum? And this is work by Timmy Gippard. He was a grad student in our group for the last 4 years, so he was really the machine learning expert, at least at the beginning of his PhD. So now I would also call him a pretty decent exoplanet expert in the meantime. And then he really, this is mostly his work, which I mentored and oversaw a bit for the last 4 years, and also gave him some input. So here it really is the question, what do we learn from these spectrum? So this is what I meant in the beginning, probably a typical simulation-based inference problem. So you make an observation, let's say with James Webb, of a planet, and then you measure a planet. So you essentially get flux as a function of wavelengths. But then your goal actually is to learn something about the planet, right? So what is the composition? Does the planet have clouds or hazes? Are there volcanoes on there? Other things. And ideally, we would need to parameterize that, right? So we, to get from here to there, we really need to simulate the physics. And that's why we need to parameterize all this, feed it in some sort of simulator that simulates how the spectrum would look like. And then somehow we want to then get back from these simulations that we do to inferring the values. And how this is typically done is with Bayesian retrieval, nested sampling, so typical MCMC loop around it. So you start with your observed spectrum, you take your simulator, your model, to simulate it. Then you draw a sample from this, and compare it with the likelihood function, see how likely it is that the data you modeled matches the data that you observed. Then you collect, some sort of posterior, these parameters, and then you simulate a new spectrum, and then, you go through this loop a million times until you have a posterior that tells you roughly, where your values are. So this is what many people do. Pi multinest, for example, is very, very widely used. Maybe some in the audience do this on a daily basis. So this is kind of like the gold standard right now for many reasons. So the first thing we looked at, as I mentioned before, we need to parameterize various things of the planet. And one of this is how we parameterize the thermal structure of the planet. And these are the so-called pressure temperature profiles, or in short, PT profiles, you can see here. So this is really important characteristic of a planet. So how does my pressure behave, or how does my temperature behave with pressure, which essentially is the altitude of the planet. So is it warm on the bottom and cold on the top? Is there an inversion in my atmosphere? So you see here, these are typical shapes, at least for Earth-like planets, of these temperature versus pressure. And there's different ways to parameterize this. So one is just semi-analytical. So there's this Madhusudan, Ziegler, or Guillot PT profiles, which many people use. You could use just some splines. It's an example in Zhang et al., or as people in our group used to do, they use polynomials to fit this. And the problem with this is this wastes a lot of parameters. So this loop here, I should have mentioned, is computationally really, really expensive, especially if you have many numbers of parameters in this simulated spectrum. So if you have this parameterization of this thermal profile here, and it has 5 parameters, and then if it's a polynomial or a spline, it doesn't even have any physical information. It's really just parameters of a curve. You're wasting a lot of parameters, just for this. And then in the end, if you retrieve them, they don't even tell you anything, or not a lot, about the planet, at least the individual parameters. So what we thought here, can we use machine learning to find, a better, maybe even lower dimensional parameterization of the thermal structures? And this is where this is one of these bottlenecks, right? So we didn't, at least in the beginning, didn't want to, replace the whole pipeline here, but first of all started with, solving one of these problems, reducing the dimensionality here, and maybe, helping the other factors to be more efficient just by replacing this one piece of it. And here we worked on actual produced data. So this is one of the cases where if you carefully produce and curate a data set, you maybe get away with doing machine learning on it. And this was actually a data set we produced at Frontier Development Lab 2019. So this is roughly 120,000 Earth-like planets around solar-type stars, fully simulated with a photochemical climate model. So this is, really, each of these models usually takes, a day, depending on the computer, of course, but it took us like a week on thousands of Google CPUs to calculate these spectra. So it's a huge computational effort to build this training data set. And these are also all representative, of these typical real climate models, these PT profiles that we used. And then the idea was, maybe we can learn some sort of representation of this forest of PT profiles that we then can use in our retrieval. And this is essentially how it works. So we take all these input profiles here. So it's, for the experts, a bit of a variation autoencoder-ish structure. So we have an encoder, first of all, that takes these input profiles from the climate model and encodes this to a lower dimensional latent space. So you essentially get a representation of all these TP profiles in, let's say, 2, 3, 4 parameters, depending on how wide you make your latent space. And then you condition this latent space on a decoder so that you put, for each input pressure, you get an output T, and then you minimize the reconstruction loss so that the T that comes out here actually looks again like the T that you put in the beginning. And if you train that long enough, and then you can also do some tricks to make sure that this latent space has a Gaussian distribution and so on. But in the end, it's really just an autoencoder. It's kind of an autoencoder and an encoder that encodes it to latent space, and then a decoder or generator that takes this latent space and produces this. And this is really, we made it, even in one case, just one dimensional. So technically, you can even get away with one dimension. So long story short, we overcame this fixed assumption or these, functional forms. We really reduced the number of parameters, and in a sense also get access to more realistic models. So these models, these PT profiles actually come out of climate models, whereas a polynomial is not really a model. It's just like a shape, like a functional shape. So this is also something that that really makes them more natural or more realistic, because they actually come out of climate models. And here you see a comparison. So here we run an actual retrieval, and the black one is the ground truth, so to speak. So this is like the planet, or the planet model we used at input, where we modeled our observation as this TP profile, and then in orange you see the TP profile that was coming out of our machine learning model, and the blue was the benchmark, until then used this polynomial PT model. And you see the values are quite off here, and our model actually fits the data much better. Obviously here in the top, because we do mid-infrared emission spectroscopy in the top layers of the atmosphere where it's really cold, there's not a lot impact on the spectrum, which you can also see on this contribution function here. So this is why it's hard to constrain the planet, the upper atmosphere of the planet with the observation, but here it worked really well. So we can really, let's say go from 6-7 parameters in the polynomial to 2, maybe 3 parameters in our autoencoder, and then also get more physical parameters. So that was pretty nice. So that was step 1. But then in step 2, we actually, and now I'm kind of like contradicting my tip from the beginning, we actually also looked into maybe replacing at least this whole MCMC nested sampling routine with something better or something more efficient, something more computationally less expensive. So the gold standard at the moment is, for some reason, MCMC nested sampling, which maybe quite a few of you in the audience are also use for their problems, and it's a great tool, right? So I don't want to bash nested sampling. And this is actually a good example for what I meant with an intangible metric. So you can discuss how useful or not useful it is, and what the shortcomings of multi-nest are, and the experts in the field maybe know what I'm talking about. But the reason why it became so popular and everyone is using it is partly also because the ease of use, because it's really like an easy to use package. You download somewhere and it's relatively easy to use. You can't really mess it up, or at least you see when you messed up. So this is what I mean by intangible metric, right? If you produce a software package that is really easy to use for other people, this is why something becomes the gold standard, or something becomes, used also by the domain experts who necessarily write Pi multinest themselves. So this is also something to keep in mind when you produce machine learning solutions that you want to be used by domain experts. Make them easy to use. And this is one example for this intangible metric. So anyway, so we wanted to see if we can find something better than Pi multinest. And here we actually went to a method called flow matching. And this is actually also a method that is used for gravitational waves, which is a very similar problem. You get these, signal from LIGO, and then you want to compare, your models to it and see which of your models of 2 black holes merging actually fits this thing that they measured there. And it's similar here, so I don't want to go too much into these technical details, but in the end, you actually solve an ODE that projects a base distribution on this posterior distribution. So you essentially learn, a vector field that gives you the posterior. So instead of doing all these individual samples from your prior and eventually, produce a posterior, you actually learn your posterior distribution here. And again, I don't want to go into the details. Also, I'm not the expert on the actual, so I just recommend you to read the papers, but this really this is really sped up the process a lot. So instead of really evaluating the model not so often, we really run the simulator a couple of times and then actually learned the estimated the posterior, which more and more becomes closer to the real posterior. And you can show that in the limit it actually produces the true posterior. Yeah, so again, I'm not an expert in this. So really contact Timmy if you want to hear more about the details. Also, check these two papers. So this one is the one with flow matching and neural importance sampling that I just showed. And this is the one where we did this parameterization of the pressure temperature profile. So dimensionality reduction problem, this one, and this one, simulation-based inference, which is maybe a widespread problem in many fields, because you usually get data and want to compare it to your models. Okay, so this was that part. So then the last part, so you almost made it to the end, and as a bit of a bonus, and for you that you paid attention to the end, we talk a bit about aliens on the moon, and this is some work that I started with Adam and Valentin, actually folks I worked with at FDL again, and if you work for 8 weeks, a whole summer, every day at the SETI Institute, you also sometimes get some crazy ideas about aliens. So our idea was, can we search for aliens on the moon? So the basic idea was really, we got these amazing images from LRO, so the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter gives us 30 centimeter, 50 centimeter pixel resolution images of the lunar surface. And you get these amazing pictures of the Apollo landing sites. So our question was, if we can train a machine learning algorithm to agnostically, with an unsupervised or semi-supervised learning approach can find those, what else would it find? So if there's, obelisk on the moon or a secret UFO base or some crashed landers from a prehistoric civilization, would we find those with these? So that was, how we started, right? So just see if machine learning could find the Apollo landing sites, and then if it finds these Apollo landing sites, what else would it find on the lunar surface? And in short, so we used a variation autoencoder architecture here again. So you essentially put your images in an encoder, you learn a latent representation, then you have a generator which regenerates your image from this latent space, and then you compare your output to your input, and after a while, if you train long enough, your output looks like your input, and then you have learned the whole lunar imagery in this latent space, so to speak, and then you can use the reconstruction loss as a anomaly score. So all the images that are pretty typical are super easy to be reproduced with this autoencoder, because that's what it learned on. But the harder it is for the network to learn it, and the bigger the reconstruction error or the loss is in the end, the more it deviates from this latent space in which you reduced your everything that you learned on. This becomes then your anomaly score. And this is what we showed here. So here you see, so this anomaly score is, let's say, the reconstruction error. So we see most of the images, fall into this big bump of typical images. And then if you look at these anomaly scores here at the tail of the distribution, you see that's where all these Apollo landing sites fall. So they really, we didn't single them out, so we don't get, total recall and absolute precision, but all of them are in the tail of the distribution. So at least we don't have to look manually to all this, typical background images here, so we can really focus on 2-3 orders of magnitude smaller data set and just look into the tail here. So what is interesting, though, is that we not only identified these Apollo landing sites, that our algorithm actually was pretty good also in finding other stuff. So we find these Apollo landing sites, of course, other landers, but we also find volcanic pits. We find these irregular mare patches. We find recent impacts. We find these super interesting rock faults, which tell us a lot about the seismic history of the moon. So it actually become a really, really cool application, not just for, looking for crashed UFOs, but actually looking for interesting geological features on the moon. And here's again some examples similar to the plots before, all samples and the positive samples, they all fall into this tail of the distribution. Here our top anomalies if we look for volcanic pits, or here when we look for fresh impacts. So all these positive things, and if not, then it's a boulder. So also something interesting. So really, really interesting, method, probably also applicable in other technosignature or SETI contexts. So essentially every time that you want to find a needle in the haystack, this is something you would use. Yeah, and that was actually fun. That kind of led, so I'm always joking, I started to look for aliens, and now I'm starting a company. So this algorithm, we try to get funding for the science of it, and then people say, yeah, maybe it's scientifically not so interesting, which I disagree with. But how about you look at commercial applications? And I'm like, fine, if that pays for my science, I can look at the commercial applications here, sure. So that over a couple of steps that led actually into lunar prospecting. We didn't start up yet, so it's more of a thought, pre-seed stage right now, where we actually think about if there are any commercial applications of not necessarily just this algorithm, but other machine learning tools applied to the lunar surface, to invest, to inform investors, to inform about landing sites, to make sure maybe even find certain deposits of certain materials that people want to harvest from the moon. So this is just the very end, bit of funny story. Sometimes these very scientific, very academic endeavors can even, without intention, lead to something that might be commercially interesting. Yeah, so this is the paper that we wrote about this with Adam and Valentin. So right now we're working on the full lunar surface. So we have a master student who's at the moment hopefully working on it, if he's not in the audience. Then also looking to other scales. Right now we look at these 64 times 64 pixels, so maybe different pixel scales. We'll also find different scales of anomalies. Obviously, also we can easily, I think, extrapolate this to other bodies. First of all, Mars, of course, but maybe also other large imaging data sets that exist. I already talked about the commercial applications and the startup. Yeah. So that's that. So just take home message, really wrapping this whole thing up. So what I already mentioned in the beginning, and I think this is the one thing, collaborate. So really it needs two hands to clap. So this is something I hopefully could convince you with these projects that I worked on, and with these maybe not so good examples I gave you in the beginning. So really find partners for this. So if you're a machine learning expert and want to see if you can solve problems in space sciences, in astrobiology, find an astrobiologist to work with, and the other way around too. So if you're an astrobiologist and you think, this problem I have, there could be a machine learning solution, go find an expert and work together. So this is really my one take-home message here is work together. And these are all the papers that I presented today again. And yeah, I'm happy to get some questions for you now. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Daniel. This is great. So yes, if you have any questions, please raise your hand, or you can post it right here in the chat. And let's see if we have any. Okay, yeah, Jeffrey Smith, I see your hands raised. Go for it.
Daniel.
Yes.
How are you?
Hi. See you. Hi. How are you?
Hi. Good to see you. Well, for other people here, my name is Jeff Smith. I worked with Daniel on the first of his 3 projects, which was characterizing exoplanetary transits. And I just want to say I really enjoyed your talk. Your lessons learned, I think were very good. Some of those I kind of smirked when you mentioned them. That I've experienced some of them as well. And anyway, so I really enjoyed the talk. I do want to say one thing about you mentioned the Frontier Development Lab, FDL, and if it's still going on. It is. I believe there's an FDL in Europe this summer. The one that happens at the SETI Institute, I'm sure people are aware of the concerns and funding and questions about the future right now. We are skipping a year. And we're going to take this as an opportunity to try to rebrand the program. One problem we found was that the name Frontier Development Lab didn't really explain what it was doing. It sounds cool, and some people know it, but we were going to rebrand it as SAIL with 2 S's, so Space Science AI Laboratory, and that actually explains what we're doing. We plan to relaunch this and have a new program next summer, so keep an eye out. Anybody here, keep an eye out for that. We're going to have a call for projects, and they're really fun programs. So we'll probably keep the FDL in there somewhere because some people know it by that, so they can maybe search for it. Anyway, I just wanted to point that out. So we should have one next summer, but not this summer.
Yes,
but Daniel, I really enjoyed your talk. It sounds like you're doing some really fun work.
Yeah, I mean, parts of that with you, right? So thanks. Yeah, looking forward to saying it then. Yeah, keep me posted. Happy to mentor again.
Certainly, we'll keep in contact.
Okay, sure, Shaq, I see your hands raised.
Yes, I want to ask that in multimodal distribution or in high dimension spaces, the MCMC or nested sampling can have struggles, right?
I'm not sure I got the whole question. So the dimensionality reduction that was just an input for the MCMC. So the MCMC, you can feed the MCMC. So in the MCMC loop, you have to somehow parameterize your TP profile to make this loop. And you can put 6 parameters as a polynomial into your loop, or you can put 2 parameters from our dimensionality reduced machine learning decoder, so to speak. And we also made sure that our latent space behaves nicely, so that it's Gaussian, so that actually if you go to a solution close in latent space, that it's still a smooth function, that you don't jump around. So I'm not sure I understood the question, but maybe I answered it excellently.
Sure, Shaq, are you good with that? Or if you want to post it also in the chat, we can always come back to it.
Yeah, maybe just write it down.
Yeah.
The connection was also a bit laggy. Yeah.
Caleb, go for it.
Thanks, and Daniel, thank you so much for a really great talk. So this is sort of a question, sort of an idea. I was interested in your anomaly detection work, and I was wondering, although it doesn't have any obvious, well, maybe it does, commercial use, thinking of big planetary type data sets that we have that might be interesting. It's not planetary, but solar data. So we have a vast trove of time resolution data on the solar disk in a variety of wavebands. And I know it's a very dynamic environment, so in that sense it's different than the lunar environment, but I'm wondering if you thought or would think at all about applying the same anomaly detection approach, the variational autoencoder, either solar flares or solar flare precursors.
Yeah, it's actually interesting idea. So I know that there's a lot of so heliophysics is one of the fields that was also within FDL one of the most successful ones, which is partly because there's so much data, right? So it's really one of the few fields, maybe, or one of the few areas, because it's like a very close object. We put like super high resolution cameras on it for decades now, or centuries even, depending on. So there was a lot of really, really cool stuff already out of FDL and other applications in heliophysics, predicting solar storms and predicting when the GPS signals get disturbed here on Earth, or super resolution. When you worked on old data at low resolution and learned on newer instruments, and then were able to increase the resolution of old data sets. So there was a lot of work actually done in heliophysics. But I like the idea to think about anomalies. So is there? So I mean, if it's really in this technosignature context, we have to think about what would aliens do to the moon that looks like an anomaly, right? Would they launch there?
I'm assuming this wouldn't be aliens on the sun.
No, it might be interesting to find, some, CMEs that didn't happen before, or maybe some projects. It's interesting. I mean, maybe that's a project for next year's FDL and sales.
There you are.
Combine that. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So it's good that you brought up heliophysics. So this is actually an example for where it's not a coincidence that there's so much success with machine learning in helioscience. It's because they have so much data, right? So this is why astrobiology with our n=1 is pretty tough. You really have to be smart where to use machine learning, because we don't have the problem that we have too much data in astrobiology, usually, for many problems, right? Yeah.
So Daniel, I had a question. This is very much like a beginner question. And kind of, you talked a lot about this confidence landscape. So for people coming into this, kind of for the first time, like fellow people in the astrobiology community, is there kind of a specific spot that you would say is a good place to start in terms of just like a certain technique, maybe even a website, or is there something, like scikit-learn, for example, scikit-learn is very popular, Python place to start, but would you say, is there a place or a certain type of tool or simple application for a person to kind of first begin with to kind of get their feet wet instead of, trying to jump right in and train, jumping right into some kind of CNN?
So I think, first of all, it might actually make sense to first of all learn about some successful applications, how people think. So maybe if watch some of the presentations of FDL, for example, right, which are usually very top level, 10-minute, from both sides, domain experts, just to get a feeling for what problems can be solved and how they are solved, not necessarily. And then when it comes to the actual coding, so what I honestly do what I use a lot is Colabs. So Google Colab, just as a platform, because it's, it's online, it's in the cloud, so you don't have to, set up your own environment at home. And sometimes you get lucky and even get a pretty decent GPU or you can work on. And then just, go through some tutorials, maybe, to clone some Colab notebooks on your own account, and then play around with it when you can't break anything. So but I think it's really important to stay humble, right? So don't think then after you entered to the first tutorial that you're suddenly a machine learning expert, right? Even if that tutorial gives you a LinkedIn certificate, you're not a machine learning expert after this, right? So specifically, when I started it like 5 years ago, I don't think these tools are still relevant. So I think maybe even working with, so I do actually, honestly, a lot of this, what they nowadays call vibe coding, where I just, talk to a machine learning or to like Perplexity or ChatGPT and tell it, maybe write me a quick program that I can paste into a Colab and then do this and that. So that's maybe learning by doing. And so I think nowadays it's probably much easier than 7 years ago when I started with all these free compute and large language models that really help you to code and stuff like this. So I think the take-home message here is really, make sure you talk to the other side. Either if you're a domain expert, talk to the machine learning expert, let them explain it, and stay humble, right? So I honestly still wouldn't call myself a machine learning expert. I understand 80% of what these people did I work with, but this is why we should collaborate, right? I don't need to know it, right? I just need to tell them what the problem is I want to solve, and this is what makes it so successful, I hope, right?
Right. Okay, that's perfect. Thank you. And it looks like we have, it looks like Adrian has a question. Could data sets such as test contain sufficient data points for transit type detection of artificial elements such as Dyson spheres? Oh man, Dyson spheres.
Yes. So there's, the most known example is this Boyajian star, right? This KIC 86 something, which was this supposedly Dyson sphere transit that people found in, was it Kepler test data? I can't even recall. So in principle, yes, depending on, so there's also work on, if there's an artificial structure, if someone, builds a rectangular shaped a sail the size of a planet and let that transit, it has a different transit shape. So there are certainly technosignatures that one could, if they were there, that one would be able to see in tests. So in principle, yes. I also know that people do some other sort of anomaly detections in there. So there's a couple of papers by Daniel Giles and some other folks, I think, who I think also Marianne Cody from the SETI Institute works on this too. So really to look for anomalies in these light curves, which then, you know, could probably be these technosignatures. So there's work on this certainly going on, yeah.
Okay, thanks. And it looks like Shershak did just rate. It looks like they wrote their question there in chat. Does MCMC nested sampling struggle with multimodal distribution?
I mean, one reason people use multi-nest over, you know, Metropolis Hastings or these classical MCCs is that it's decent if you have to avoid being lost in local minima, if that's what the question is. And then multimodal in the sense of dimensionality, it gets more and more complicated. So it's it's a hard problem. You know, the more you increase your parameters, the harder it gets exponentially to do these MCMC loops. And then what really is the problem of MCMC, sometimes it's really of nested sampling, is that it's very confident but very wrong. So sometimes you just miss it, and it's just computationally super expensive if you do this on a large scale. So I mean, it always depends on your application. So I'm still not sure if I'm really answering the right question, because I'm not sure exactly what they mean with multimodal distribution in that sense. But yeah, it's a good example for sometimes even these methods we just developed for spectral retrieval of exoplanets. It really depends on the application. So you might use a different machine learning model if you want to retrieve a single precious James Webb spectra. And then if you want to model thousands of exoplanet observations with a live telescope in the future, there's probably a different algorithm, a different machine learning model that you want to use. In the first case, you want a super precise, you know, maybe, you know, longer trained model, whereas in the second case, you get away with 10% loss, but then have a faster one. So this is probably also something that even if you solve the same problem in a different context, it might still need a different machine learning algorithm to use.